Hi, everybody. So I'm just Halie here. Dr. Halie Olson is a good friend and collaborator of mine, so I thought I'd take this opportunity to introduce her. So Halie has always been interested in child development. In fact, she's the older sister of 2 boys, and her parents used to have to tell her, please stop parenting our children. We can do it ourselves. She's always been very interested in guiding child development. She went to Harvard University for her undergrad, and she worked in the lab of Chuck Nelson there, who is also a famous developmentalist who worked on the Bucharest, right, Bucharest child study. After that, she did her PhD in the lab of John Gabrielli at MIT. And that's where we met and we overlapped and got to work together on a lot of projects. And she's now a postdoctoral fellow in the lab of Ed Fedorenko at MIT. Something you should know about Halie and something she'll probably talk about today is that she does not shy away from a challenge. So not only is she an avid runner, she does some amazing marathon running and some really niche kinds of marathon runs, but also her projects are always using the most challenging population. So today she'll be talking about awake scanning for language in toddlers, which is a notoriously difficult age range to scan. And so, yeah, Halie, take it away.
Thanks, Anila, for the lovely introduction, and thank you all for being here. I'm really excited to share some of my work with you. All right, we're hoping that Teams cooperates with me. Okay, so I don't need to convince you all that language is a core component of human cognition that plays a pivotal role throughout the lifespan. Language is fundamentally shaped by our experiences, what language a child is exposed to, the specific words they encounter, and it's also fundamentally shaped by the underlying biological constraints of the brain that support this uniquely human cognitive function. And I like this tree metaphor not only because I think it captures the interplay between experience and biological predisposition during development, but also because I think it reflects this ongoing potential for language learning throughout the lifespan. And yet, of course, the most rapid and remarkable period of language development is not happening to us now as adults, but rather within the first few years of life. And so that's what I'm interested in, this interplay between experience, the brain, and language, the brain, and experiences during development. And sometimes this entails measuring language itself, either children's production or comprehension. Sometimes it involves studying the underlying neural mechanisms that support this behavior. And sometimes that involves measuring or sometimes manipulating language experiences that a developing child encounters. And experience can capture many things, but one that I'm particularly interested in is the social context in which language is encountered. Sometimes language is encountered through observation of other people having conversations. And sometimes language is encountered when someone is speaking directly to you as a child, as an adult. And so with this very simple metaphor framework in mind, I'm going to tell you about 3 different lines of work that I think nicely capture this interplay between language experience and the brain. All right. So first, I'm going to tell you about a project in which I've used fMRI to examine the neural basis of language processing in toddlers. And this will be the bulk of the talk, so if it feels like it's taking most of the time, it is intentional. But with whatever time I have left, I will briefly tell you about some work in older children that takes an individual level factor, specifically children's interests, into account when examining the neural basis of language processing in both neurotypical and autistic children. And finally, I'll close by just briefly teasing some of my current directions, including leveraging large language models in conjunction with fMRI in children. And I'm happy to talk about any of these things later as well. I'll be here for a couple of days and happy to chat more. All right, and I have this handy little timeline here to situate which stage of development that I'm focusing on. And so I'm going to start with what I think is the coolest period of time from a developmental standpoint, and that's toddlerhood. So in this project, we investigated the functional architecture of the brain's language system in toddlers. This is some work that I started during my PhD with Rebecca Sachs, have continued with Rebecca as well as Ed Fedorenko into my postdoc. And I will also, in addition to talking about some of the toddler data, I'll also present some what I think are interesting empirical findings from adults both as a point of comparison, but also to examine conversation processing. All right, so before getting to toddlers, I want to briefly talk about the end state. So what language processing looks like in the adult human brain. And we know a fair bit about this from decades of research. We know that in general, language elicits left lateralized frontotemporal responses in cortex. Now, these are not the only regions that are engaged in language processing, especially when we think about processing language in context. Some cortical regions, cerebellum, are also involved and integrally involved in comprehending and processing language. But for today's talk, I'm going to focus on these left lateralized frontal and temporal regions because they show a particularly interesting property of being selective for language. And what this means is that when you individually find these regions in different people and you test their responsiveness to different cognitive tasks, they respond really strongly to language that you understand, whether you're understanding it or whether you're producing it, no matter what modality it's presented in, whether it's written, spoken, signed. And these regions respond pretty low, have a pretty low response to all sorts of other cognitive functions, including those that share a lot of similarities with language, like working memory or comprehending computer code or listening to music. And so one thing that we might wonder as developmentalists in particular is how the brain comes to be this way. How do we get some bits of cortex that in individuals becomes particularly specialized for processing language? And this is where I think we need to turn to toddlers, because if we want to understand how the brain is comprehending language as early as we can, toddlers are kind of the ideal place to start. Toddlerhood is a period of immense change across the board, but especially in language comprehension and production. This is a plot from some of Mike Frank's work from a task called the Communicative Development Inventory. Basically, parents are asked to mark off which words their child knows and says from a list of hundreds of words. And what you'll see here, this is age on the x-axis and production on the y-axis from about 16 to 30 months. And you'll see these lines showing these huge changes in language production and comprehension, but also all of these individual dots, which represent individual participants. And so what stands out to me here is not just these remarkable changes that happen over a pretty short period of time, but also the vast individual differences that are sometimes predictive of language delays or disorders, and sometimes it's just variation in language production. And so there's a lot happening in this toddlerhood period. There are a lot of individual differences. It's also a critical period of time for interventions. If we want to intervene on language development, this is kind of the time to do so. But behaviorally, it's really hard to get a sense of what language development looks like. It's also really hard. I don't know how many of you have spent much time with a 2-year-old, but they are not always the most compliant participants, and that goes for our scanning as well. And so to get a look at language processing in the brain, and especially with fMRI, a study that really inspired me was from Elizabeth Redkay back in 2008. She examined speech processing in sleeping toddlers, finding evidence for some developmental change. But she could only make inferences about speech processing and not language comprehension because the toddlers were asleep. And so if we really want to understand language comprehension, what the brain is doing when a child is actually trying to understand the language that they're exposed to, we have to study them while they're awake. And so that's one of the things I set out to do in grad school, is figure out a way to scan awake toddlers. People generally don't do that because convincing a toddler to get in a large machine and stay very still is kind of hard. So we frame the experience as a trip to space in our rocket ship. It gives a plausible cover story for putting them in a large tube. We have a number of pre-visit preparation strategies to get kids and their parents comfortable before they come in. We send them this video, which is not played at 4x speed, and includes a little voiceover walking them through the visit. We take a really flexible approach, try to meet each kid where they're at. Sometimes that involves 20 minutes of walking around the rocket ship to say, yep, it has a back, we can go around. And oftentimes we bring kids back for multiple sessions in order to get usable data. Now, of course, once we get them in the MRI, we want them to stay there. And so we also thought a lot about what stimuli we should use that would be engaging, but also work for our purposes. So just to touch on this a little bit, when we were thinking about stimuli design, we were trying to balance a few desiderata. On the one hand, there's been a large body of work, especially with slightly older kids, showing that using multimodal, child-friendly, and naturalistic stimuli is really effective for keeping kids still and getting high-quality fMRI data. On the other hand, a drawback of these naturalistic stimuli, like showing movies in the scanner, is that sometimes they don't have the control conditions that allow you to extract a specific response. You can do lots of other types of analyses with these naturalistic stimuli, but if we want to get interpretable results that are comparable to prior literature, the decades of literature on fMRI processing, or using fMRI to looking at language processing, we want to compare some kind of language comprehension to a lower level control. And in addition, ideally, we wanted a task that not only worked with toddlers, but also one that worked across a wider age range and a wider range of populations. A limitation of some developmental work, and especially language, but it's also kind of across the board, is that you can't always use the same stimuli very effectively across populations. And since I'm particularly interested in this developmental trajectory and how processing of language might change over time, I wanted to start with a task that would work for the hardest age group, but that would also effectively elicit a language response across a much wider age range. And so to balance these desiderata, we turned to the best tool in our toolbox, which was Sesame Street. And so we designed a block design task. It's a 2x2 design where we manipulated the comprehensibility of the speech using forward and backward speech. And we also manipulated the social context in which language is encountered using dialogue videos and monologue videos. So I'll show you what that looks like. So here's our forward dialogue video.
Bubbles, beautiful bubbles. Oh, hi, Elmo. Hi, Abby. Oh, did you see all those bubbles? They're so enchanting. Yeah, Elmo saw them. I wonder where they came from. Well, Elmo made them.
All right, so kids would watch a bunch of 20-second videos of Sesame Street characters talking to each other. Here's what the monologue video looked like. So it's 10 seconds of one character and then 10 seconds of another.
Look what I've got. Dominoes. See, I've set up a whole bunch of them in a line, and I've just got to add one more.
All right, so now here's the critical part. I showed you these videos that do include language, but they have a bunch of other things in them as well. There are characters, there are talking, there are noises, there are colors, there's context. And so if we want to control for everything going on except for the comprehensibility of language, we needed to account for all of those things. And so what we did is we created versions of these clips. We reversed the audio by characters and lined it up with the mouth movements. So now these are incomprehensible, but still maintain the other aspects of the videos like this. And for completion, here's our monologue. All right, and so hopefully you have the impression that we're balancing out both the fun, multimodal, child-friendly aspects of these stimuli, but you can also see where we're implementing this control in our backwards condition to control for the characters on the screen, the kind of social context, the colors, the visual experience, and also the auditory. So with these stimuli in hand, we set out to measure language comprehension in toddlers. First, you don't have to take my word for it. We wanted to make sure that the task actually reliably elicited a language response. And then we use them to measure language evoked responses in toddlers. So for the first point, before just kind of going off and using this task with a bunch of toddlers, we wanted to make sure that it overlapped with a previously validated task that didn't have these videos that just isolated comprehensible and incomprehensible speech. We wanted to see whether we could look for typical responses to language. We wanted to see whether there was left lateralization for language in an adult sample, and also whether responses to comprehensible language were extractable from subject-specific regions in the brain. So to do this, we scanned 20 adults. They had a lot of fun with the Sesame Street task, for what it's worth. Way more fun than the typical tasks we use. And for our language contrast, for now, I'm collapsing across the monologue and dialogue conditions and showing you the difference between the forward and the backwards. When we look across the whole group and the whole brain, we see what looks like a language response. We're seeing bilateral activation, but there's more on the left side than the right, including some frontal and temporal regions that are responding more to the forward than backward speech function. And this maps on pretty well to what we would expect from a typical language task. Within individuals, we also wanted to make sure that the language contrast that we extracted from our task was similar to a language contrast from a previously validated task. So in addition to doing our Sesame Street task, we also had them do an auditory language localizer task where they listen to blocks of intact speech, so like me talking to you now, and an acoustically degraded version. So there are no visuals here, it's just intact and a lower level control of acoustically degraded speech. We looked within these general large parcels for language processing and calculated a dice coefficient. So looking at the overlap between the response elicited by our task and the other task. 1 would indicate perfect overlap between the two. 0 would indicate no overlapping voxels, so the higher the better. So I'll plot our task in blue, the other task in green, and this is a visual representation of the overlap in this left anterior temporal parcel. And indeed, we get a really nice high overlap. Each of those dots is an individual participant. And we see this across the other language parcels, these larger areas that contain language-specific regions as well. All right, so given that we had this overlap, that was a nice sanity check that our task was at least eliciting a language response. We wanted to also see whether we could get, or whether we observed left lateralization for language in individuals. So here we again are restricted our analyses to these parcels that typically contain language regions in the darker blue on the brain. And we calculated lateralization index, looking at the number of suprathreshold voxels in left parcels compared to the number of suprathreshold voxels on the right. So a value that's a positive value indicates more left lateralization, a negative value indicates right lateralization. And there are there's individual variability between adults. Some had much more bilateral responses, but overall we were observing this left lateralized bias for language processing using our task in adults. And so this was, again, just a nice sanity check that we were able to see some individual variation, but also this kind of expected pattern of left lateralization. The final sanity check we did with our adults before applying our task in toddlers was to see if we could extract responses to comprehensible language in subject-specific regions. The reason we did this is because one problem that as neuroscientists we always have to account for is the fact that each person's brain is different. And our brains are not only different from a structural standpoint, but also from a functional one. My interior temporal parcel for language is slightly different from someone else's. And when we average them all together, we can sometimes miss out on important variation between individuals. This is a figure from one of Ed Fedorenko's papers. These are 6 individual subjects. All of them did a language task, so it's all the same contrast between comprehensible language and some lower level control. And what you see is that they are roughly engaging the same, left frontal and temporal regions, but they're not in exactly the same place. And so there are many ways that you can account for this kind of individual variation. One of them that we're using here is to select the specific voxels within a larger region that are most selective for the function that you care about, and then test what those regions do in independent data. And so I'm using these larger parcels that I showed you on previous slides, and we're selecting the top 100 voxels for each person for each of these different regions. All right, and so typically, especially when you're scanning adults or older children, you have a completely separate localizer task if you want to use this approach. With our toddlers, the problem was the Sesame Street task was the only thing we were going to get. And so what we did here, although we also did it using a separate localizer task, but what we did here is take independent runs of data to define the top voxels that respond to this language contrast, and then extract responses to the other conditions in held out runs. We did an iterative leave one run out approach. We're defining and testing in independent data. And so what I'm plotting here is the magnitude of the response. I'm going to start again with this left anterior temporal parcel just as an example, and I'll plot the response to forward and backward speech. which we see here, as expected for a region that cares about language. We're seeing much higher responses to the comprehensible speech than the backward speech consolidation. Each of those dots is an individual participant, and the lines connect their responses. And we see this in other regions, all the other regions as well. All right, and so this was kind of our final sanity check to make sure that we could actually elicit these subject-specific regions that were sensitive to language. With that, we felt confident that our task did reliably elicit a language response in adults. And so then we started turning to younger populations. I won't talk about it here, but we did test in some individual children. It worked pretty well for kids. Again, they liked the Sesame Street. But the population we really cared about was the toddlers. All right, so can we use this task to measure a language evoked response in toddlers? Hopefully, yes, otherwise this is a big waste of your time. But we wanted to see, can we measure a language response? Is this language evoked activation left lateralized already in toddlers? And our language region, so before I kind of leaned on this language region definition based on a lot of prior literature that has characterized these regions in different ways, here we're in a new space, and so I'm not quite calling these regions language regions yet. That's what we're still trying to figure out. So language in quotes is me not standing and saying that these are definitely just responding to language quite yet. All right, so first, can we measure a language response? For our toddler data, I'm going to show you data from 26 toddlers between the ages of 19 and 36 months. And we pre-registered our stopping point before embarking on this quest. We spent a lot of time scanning toddlers. To get those 26 toddlers, it took 107 sessions and 89 toddlers coming in. So I spent many weekends in the scanner. It's great. Here's a little visual representation of our success rates. So we have age on the x-axis. Participants are individual rows here. The red, you'll see a lot of red. Those are the data. Those are the participants that didn't even get in the scanner at all. About 50% of our kids just like did not get in the scanner, even with all of our prep work. Toddlers are really hard. And then some of them we didn't get usable data from, but we do have a nice smattering of green. So we have our 26 toddlers with usable high-quality data. And the other nice thing is that we got a nice spread of age and vocabulary. So again, age is on the x-axis here. On the y-axis, this is that same vocabulary assessment that I showed you the plot from earlier, where parents mark off which words their child knows and says. As you might expect, there's a pretty strong correlation here where the younger toddlers know fewer words than the older kids. But we have a nice spanning. All right, so with our precious 26 toddlers, what did we see? So here, I'll show you what the adults look like just as a nice comparison point. We'll start by looking at the whole brain response, averaging across our whole group. Here again is what the adults look like. And here is our toddler data. I'm using a lower threshold for everything I'm showing you in the toddlers. I will say that up front that it does not survive the same threshold levels that we typically use for adult data. The data is messier and it's a much more subtle contrast, and I'm happy to talk about why I think that might be later as well. Basically, that they don't totally know language yet is the short end of it. But when we look averaging across our whole group, we are seeing some activation, especially in like left temporal areas. That does seem to be a little bit more on the left side of the brain than the right. Similar, although not quite the same as what we see in our adults. And just as a sanity check to show you that we didn't have to get these regions when averaging across the whole group. Here I'm just going to show you the group response to dialogue versus monologue. So here we have the comprehensible and incomprehensible mixed in, but the difference is whether it's two characters on the screen talking to each other or just one at a time. And as we might expect from this kind of contrast, we're getting much more activation in visual cortex, again, two characters on the screen, and also some kind of like STS and social processing regions as well. And so I won't dive into this at the moment. We're still kind of working through it, but the gist to take away here is that the language response in the whole group does seem to be different than when we look at, say, a different contrast. So can we measure a language response? I think the answer is yes, which is very great to hear. Another thing we were interested in is whether language evoked activation would already be left lateralized in toddlers. There's been a fair amount of work in the developmental literature that's investigated why language might be lateralized to the left side of cortex, and whether that's something that emerges really early or whether the brain is initially more bilateral for language and then becomes more lateralized over time. We know that early damage to left cortex oftentimes still leads to typical language development and language evoked activation on the right side of the brain. But we also know that in infants and studies of newborn babies or very young babies, when they're processing speech, again, they're not comprehending language, but that speech processing might show bias to the left side of the brain. So there's kind of contradictory evidence as to whether these responses should already be left lateralized or whether they might be more bilateral early on. And so we, again, looked at this forward greater than backward contrast and calculated our lateralization index. Here again as adults, so as a reminder, more positive values indicate more left lateralization, negative right lateralization. And the toddlers are kind of surprising. They are, you could look at this and say, oh, they're very bilateral. But what I find particularly surprising is that we have some subset of toddlers that are very left lateralized and a few that are actually very right lateralized. One thing that might account for this is that in adults, we restricted to right-handed participants who are more likely to have left lateralized language activation. In our toddlers, we didn't have a reliable marker of handedness yet. And so it's possible that those very right lateralized kiddos might actually be left-handed and have sort of a flipped language system. I'm in the process of following up with families right now, since it's been enough time that hopefully we can get some handedness measures. So the jury is still out on this. It certainly does not seem like we have a super left lateralized language system, at least across the board. It seems like there's a lot of individual variation here, but still.
That be at all influenced by the thresholds you selected?
Mm-hmm. That's the other, that was also part of our pre-registration, and one of the next things on my to-do list is to see how sensitive it is to the threshold. So here you'll notice I used a much lower threshold for the toddlers than the adults. I initially tried the adult threshold, and there were so few voxels that a couple voxels could really swing the lateralization index. And so, yes,
if you drop the threshold for the adults, would that become less?
At some point, yes, if you use a low enough threshold, it will drop off. So it is a tricky problem to see, you know, where we get that kind of asymptote and where it might drop off. Yeah, if you have a low enough threshold, yes, it would drop off a bit. And for the toddlers, so check out the paper once I have it done. But yes, I'm imagining having a plot with different thresholds to see how threshold dependent those responses are. Because I have been puzzled by that. This seemed like a reasonable middle threshold where I was having where I had a decent number of super threshold voxels that were identified at this particular threshold. But yes.
Follow up on that.
Yeah.
And would it differ by the region? So if you just look for the frontal.
Quite plausibly. Yeah, I think it's plausible. We get, and I'll get to this in a moment, we get more robust responses in temporal regions than frontal regions anyway. So yes, I would imagine that using different thresholds for different regions would give you different answers. I think it's hard to know what that means. And so I think no matter what, the lateralization results are going to need to be taken with a grain of salt. And I think they're kind of complementary to some of the other analyses. But I don't think that I agree that I think that threshold choices will be important and useful to follow up on with my others.
Just very quickly,
Yeah.
What's the rationale for using super threshold voxels in the first place? An
Yeah.
alternative would simply be to normalize response magnitude
Yeah.
and to do a direct assessment of the magnitude of the response, ignoring threshold.
Yes.
So you could just do something like a Cohen's d
Yeah.
across all of the voxels in a region of interest and measure that.
Yes.
What's
What's the
for
reason
not
for
doing
doing that? So typically the two converge, the spatial, like lateralization base. So this is a spatial measure of lateralization, to your point. So it's not taking the magnitude of the response into account at all. I'm planning to do both. This was the one we started with, but yes. And I think that the magnitude might end up being a more reliable marker of lateralization.
I think so, particularly in noisy delta.
Yes. Yeah. I think that I agree.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yes. Please keep interrupting me. I should have said that at the beginning. So the answer to is language evoked activation left lateralized? I don't know yet. And if others have, I didn't promise to have all the answers, but I do think we can measure response. But yes, working on that one. So the final question that I will talk about today is whether these regions that seem to respond to language in adults and older children already responding to this comprehensibility contrast in toddlers. So again, in adults, we see these really robust differences between the forward and backward conditions. In toddlers, here's our left anterior temporal parcel. So this is forward speech and backward speech. There is a statistically significant difference here. They are responding. So this is where we are defining an individual's. Here for the toddlers, we have 16 kiddos that have multiple usable runs of data so that we can define regions of interest in independent data and then test in held out runs. And so we are seeing in this left anterior temporal parcel, here now I'm showing the difference between language and the control condition in these 5 regions that I told you about. So in these 2 inferior frontal gyrus regions and this anterior temporal parcel, we're getting stronger responses to the forward compared to backward speech when we test in independent data. In MFG and in the posterior temporal region, we're not. So even though we're selecting voxels in the first run that are responding more to forward than backward speech, when we look at another run, they're not reliably responding more to forward than backward speech, which to me actually gives a little bit more confidence in the methodology that you don't have to find a difference between the 2, even when you're selecting based on that difference. And so overall, it seems like there is some initial sensitivity to these comprehensibility manipulations, but that it's not very strong. These regions are responding quite similarly between the 2 conditions. And briefly, just to kind of give my own hypothesis of what is going on here, these children, they're 2, they don't have full language yet. And even in the forward speech condition, they understand some of the language, but they don't understand all of it. And in the backward speech condition, we gave them all the cues to think that this is 2 characters communicating with each other. They have consistent voices, they have faces, they're looking at each other, they're in context. And so to me, I think it's actually really interesting that the difference might be very subtle in toddlers whose job it is to figure out what is meaningful language around them. So are these, regions that are, specialized for language in adults already reliably responding more to language in toddlers? It's a bit of a mixed bag. Some of these regions, yes, seem to already be showing this sensitivity, and some of them no. And so it certainly is not the same very strong response profile that we see in adults. Yeah.
Do you find that there's more run-to-run variability in the toddlers, like overall than the adults? Because then, we always think about with these approaches where you're defining in one run and then extracting in another run, does the spatial variability of like what exact voxels are responding to language, does that matter?
Yeah, that's a good question. My guess is yes, because there's more variability in everything across the board. I don't know that I think it accounts for, I think it might contribute to what we're seeing. I doubt it would explain everything in terms of this. Yes. So yeah, I think there is more run-to-run variability. I haven't quantified that specifically yet to show you. I think it might make a difference. But I also think that these regions are just not as specialized as they become.
How did you deal with motion?
Yeah, throwing out a lot of data. Yeah.
And then it looked like from the usable data, sometimes it came from different days, but you pulled it together?
So I combined data if they came in within 6 weeks of each other. So if they had 2 visits that were less than 6 weeks apart, they were combined. Some kiddos, I collected some longitudinal data that I'm not collapsing across here that I'll look at later. So if you see green dots that are very far apart, those are that the later one is not used for this analysis. Yeah. Yes.
Just a short question. So how much is the role that you see in terms of the inference that is playing with the toddlers data compared to the adults data? Because with the toddlers data, you have more of the role of an inference that they have to make because they don't, even in the language condition, they don't really, and they're making more of inference. And with the control conditions, it's completely inference. Whereas with the adults, it's they understand the language, which may be more lateralized in this case, compared to the control condition.
I'm gonna have you hold that question for a moment because I'm gonna show some additional adult data where we look within like theory of mind regions and some other regions to show different profiles of responses to these different conditions,
Sure.
Which gets more into your question about like what inferences are being made there. Yeah, so I'll have you hold that for just a moment. I'll move on for now. We'll get back to that. So are language regions specialized for language processing in toddlers? I think not quite yet, but the ways in which they're not quite yet specialized, I think there's a lot more work to fill in the gaps. But I do think we can measure language evoked activation in toddlers, and I think it's a really important and exciting place to be looking because so much is happening during this period of time. Now, starting to get to your question here, I want to return to this idea of social context because so far everything I was showing you collapsed across these monologue and dialogue conditions, which are very different types of exposure to language. And even from an observer standpoint, even taking out the difference between having a conversation with someone or observing others, even just observing 2 people having a conversation or observing someone like me talking to you here is quite different between dialogue and monologue. In dialogue, you have this turn taking. There are distinctive features that coordinate and monitor the creation of common ground. You're building up conversation together, creating something that's more than the sum of utterances. There are 2 minds interacting to create these conversations. And so successive utterances are not only conveying meaning, but also often showing how a prior utterance was understood. And their reference across speaker boundaries. Yes, do you have a question?
Yeah.
Sorry.
So were the toddlers that you, the data that was usable, were they all from a monolingual background or?
No, so I actually have some toddlers, so I had some monolingual English speakers, and then I had some toddlers that were growing up with varying amounts and types of exposures to other languages. In at least the analyses that I've done so far, controlling for multilingual exposure has not changed the results, but I think it's a really interesting avenue of work to think about how that might affect the developing language system. Yeah. Happy to return to that idea too, because it's something I think about. Okay, so right, monologue, dialogue, different. And as a first step, one thing we can do is look at the univariate responses in these language regions and see whether monologue and dialogue engage the language system to the same extent or to a different extent. So here in adults, here I'm actually using this separate localizer contrast. I did it both ways using the iterative leave one run out, but this is kind of a cleaner. We defined these regions from this intact versus degraded contrast and tested. So to start, here's this left inferior temporal parcel. And now I'm showing you forward dialogue, forward monologue, and backward monologue. And what we see is, again, higher responses to the comprehensible language than the incomprehensible language, but no difference in the magnitude for the dialogue versus monologue. And we see this across these other kind of individually defined canonical language regions as well. The language system in adults seems to care about whether language is comprehensible or not, and not the social context, even this pretty big distinction between dialogue and monologue. Now, one thing to note is that we used a block design here, which is a pretty powerful but fairly blunt tool. And we measured and averaged the magnitude of the response across the whole block. And what I just finished telling you about 30 seconds ago is that some of the most interesting cognitive processing that happens during dialogue and some of the most distinctive features of conversation happen at a much more fine-grained time scale. And so if we want to know whether language regions are sensitive to this buildup of utterances across speakers, we might want a different task design than this block design task that I showed you. And luckily we have one. And so this task we unfortunately only have in the adults, so I don't have it for toddlers, at least yet. But in addition to our block design task that I showed you, we also created a second, slightly more naturalistic task, which embedded both forward and backward speech within a single conversation. How's that look?
What may I do for you today?
Nice going on, Rob.
Yes, sir.
Rescue in the suit on arrow,
Yes, sir, yes.
All right, so participants watched like these 3-minute clips that were full clips of a conversation between two characters. They were also pretty fun, and I'll breeze through this. Just as a sanity check, we did look at the univariate response when we created a regressor that took all the forward segments versus all the backward segments. And we did get reliably stronger responses to forward than backward speech in our language regions. Again, just a nice sanity check. We saw these in other regions as well. But the nice thing about this task is that it's not limited to a block design univariate task analysis, but we can actually look at the activation language regions over time. And critically, while half of our participants saw one version of the clips where, say, Elmo was forward and Adam was backward, we had the other half of participants watch the exact same clips, but the comprehensible speaker was flipped. So it's the exact same story, the same visual, the same inferences potentially being drawn, but who was comprehensible at any given moment in time was exactly flipped. And so in a brain region that only cared about the comprehensibility of the utterances, there's nothing in common between these two subsets. But in a brain region that cares about conversation, even if you only have my utterances, you have some of the shared meaning that's created. And so in other words, these two groups should have something in common how they're responding. And so again, I'm just going to use this left anterior temporal parcel as an example. We can look at activation over time for each participant. Here, I'll just take one held out subject from this one group. We can then average together all of the other participants in the same group who watched the same video with the same characters forward versus backward. You can see there's some nice correspondence there. And then we can take the average of the other group. So they're watching the same videos, but who's comprehensible at any given time is flipped. And I can overlay here which segments are forward for which groups. So starting to look at it, you might see that the group that is blue goes up when it's blue. So this looks nice, but we can also quantify this by looking at the correlation between a held out subject and the average of the group that saw the exact same video and heard the exact same audio stream, and then the same held out participant and the average of the other group that saw the same videos, but the comprehensibility was flipped. And so we have a nice positive correlation for a held out participant and the same group, and essentially no correlation for a held out participant and the opposite stream. And we see this across the other individually defined language regions as well. So these language regions don't seem to be representing any of this shared meaning that you were asking about when we're using these like ISV analyses. And so the context that's connecting these two speakers that makes conversation meaningful is not being computed in these language regions in adults. But obviously this shouldn't be the case in all regions. And so as one example, here is right temporal parietal junction, RTPJ, which has bits that are specialized for a theory of mind reasoning. I chose this because we happen to have our adults also do a functional localizer task for theory of mind. And so here, so first looking at the univariate pattern, when we average the responses, when we look at the responses to our 4 conditions in the first task, so not the alternating, this first task, here we see a different profile where the highest response is for the forward dialogue condition. There's still an effective comprehensibility. So these theory of mind regions are responding more when they can understand, but also more for the dialogue conditions than the conditions. And so, but what's more interesting is we can also do, in the second task, use the correlation analysis. Here again, when we look at our TPJ, held out subject in the same group, positive correlation as we might expect. But what I think really stands out compared to what I showed you for language regions is that we also get a nice positive correlation with the held out subject on the opposite. It's a little bit lower than the same group because the information conveyed by language is a little different between the two, but a lot is shared by this context that you were referring to. And so I think when we take these together, I think it paints a nice picture showing that these language regions really do seem to have quite a distinct profile in adults. And we also looked at regions of the brain that seem to specifically care about conversation. This was an exploratory analysis where we looked at regions that responded more to forward than backward and also more to dialogue than monologue. And we identified a few clusters that show this profile, including this right STS and right temporal pole. And so those are regions that I'm planning to look at in the toddlers as well to see if they also show some sensitivity to the comprehensible conversation. All right, so I showed you that in adults, language regions really don't seem to be carrying out the work of processing conversation-specific cognition. And even at this fairly gross level of monologue versus dialogue, which differ on a bunch of different dimensions, we're not seeing univariate differences between the two. Now, turning to development, I think this is still an open question. There's been a lot of behavioral as well as neuroimaging studies that point to deep links between social cognition and language learning. And as I mentioned before, a lot of the social cues that were present in these videos really scaffold language learning during development. And so it seems plausible that this might be reflected in the brain's response as well. Even if adult language regions are only sensitive to the core features of language, perhaps toddlers later to be language regions might be sensitive to some of these manipulations. And so some of the ongoing questions that I'm thinking about, and I don't have definitive answers for you yet, but do language and social processing modulate distinct networks in toddlers as they do in adults? And do distinctive brain responses to social aspects of stimuli emerge before, after, or at the same time as distinctive responses to language? And so just to give you a taste of what I'm looking at here, again, we only have the univariate block design task, a univariate analyses in the block design task. This is again in the adults. In the toddlers so far, this is this left anterior temporal parcel again, we're actually seeing the same pattern of sensitivity to comprehensibility, but not a sensitivity to the monologue dialogue distinction. And that is the same in these other regions as well that show the comprehensibility division. I expected to see it here, so this is me saying that I was surprised. But I'm really interested to see whether there are different ways to tap into how social context may be affecting responses to language. And so for this section, and this might be, so this will be the bulk of the talk, so I will wrap up soon. We found that engaging dynamic language stimuli in naturalistic context can be effective in our studies with young children. We can measure a language evoked response from awake toddlers using fMRI. And in adults, language regions are sensitive to comprehensibility rather than other aspects of observed conversation. And I think the jury is still out in terms of how toddlers' brains are responding to those things. All right, and I will switch, I will tell you just a 2-minute version of some of the ongoing work that I have before switching to questions, just so we have a little time at the end. But I figured I would mention some current directions. Please want to chat with me about them later. So in my postdoc, I'm continuing to look at language development and interplay between experience and brain. One project that I'm doing is looking at the development and functional organization of the language network, the language system in children with interesting brains. So children who have congenital cysts, perinatal strokes, other structural atypicalities in the brain, specifically affecting the cortical regions that, cortical areas that language typically, that typically subserve language. Where is language processing happening instead, and do those responses change over developmental time? And on the experience side, one project that I'm working on is comparing children's brain responses to large language models to test the effects of experience on the representational space of language. I'll just briefly touch on this a little bit more because it's kind of fun. We know that large language models are really good at predicting language. probably, it's hard to find anyone who has not in some way interacted with one of these ChatGPT type models now, even if not explicitly using ChatGPT. It seems to be everywhere. It's almost ubiquitous in our current technological world. These models are really good at predicting language. What I found incredibly surprising is that these large language models are also pretty good at predicting neural responses to language. This was another one where in science we're often wrong. I thought that this was the silliest idea. I thought that these models were doing language in a completely different way than the brain would be, and so there should be no reason that a language model would predict brain responses. It turns out that in adults, language models actually can do a pretty good job of predicting which sentences will elicit stronger activation within the language system. Given that, I think there are some really interesting applications to study language development kids. In particular, it allows us to actually manipulate language experience in a way that's really hard to do at the level that would affect the brain. I've done other intervention type studies where we try to manipulate children's language experiences, and the effects are very subtle because there's only so much you can do with a real child living out in a real world, being exposed to language in a bunch of different ways. To ethically manipulate language experience at the level that we would expect it to have a big effect on the brain is kind of impossible. But with language models, we can feed very different types of language experience into a model and see how that predicts or is similar to or different from how kids' brains respond to language. And so in some ongoing work, we're testing whether large language models trained on age-matched amounts of language data recapitulate developmental shifts in linguistic representational space. So is a language model that's had a similar amount and type of experience to a 6-year-old better at predicting 6-year-olds' brain responses than adults' brain responses? Or is a fully trained model just always going to be better at predicting all of them and there isn't any meaningful kind of developmental change that's captured in this training regime? And one thing that is to kind of come back to this idea of methodological challenges in developmental work, one thing that was a bit of a roadblock for this project was collecting enough high quality fMRI data to do these kinds of analyses. You need hundreds to 1,000 items that, and you need a child to be very still in the scanner while you're collecting them. I'm not trying to do this study in 2-year-olds, this is older children, but even asking, an 8-year-old to lay very still in the scanner and watch lots and lots and lots of carefully chosen sentences is tricky. For these kind of studies, you need hundreds of unique items. You want them to be engaging, audiovisual, because you don't want confounds with reading ability or other confounds that appear. And so we created a pipeline with a wonderful undergrad of mine. And we have a bunch, hundreds and hundreds of these little aliens speaking sentences.
Promise me you won't put yourself in danger.
You just imagine a child in the scanner.
Boss 2 will set he full other.
So that is a wordless condition. And so normally for those of you who have designed stimuli before, creating like 1,000 of those videos would take a very, very long time. But my fabulous student Bianca Santi spent a lot of time along with some other undergrads of mine creating a stimuli pipeline which automates the process. So rather than taking weeks and weeks and weeks, we could generate 100 or almost 880 stimuli within about a day for audiovisual stimuli, which has been very useful to us. Happy to share those resources as well. All right, and with that, I just want to thank my many collaborators, my funders, and especially the participants and families that spent their time doing this research. All right, I think we have like 5 minutes left for questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Any questions?
So I'm sure you're well aware of Nick Turk-Brown's work in very small babies looking at memory. I think they went down to 4 months old. Are you tempted to try to look? Obviously, this is before the kids can talk, but it'd be very interesting to know what the brain responses to language as opposed to non-language like stimuli look like in say a 4 to 6 month old. Are you tempted to have a go at that?
I am tempted. Rebecca and I have been talking about this for at least the last 3 years, whether to extend this down to infants. And we haven't yet. I think at some point I will for sure. And you're right. So the studies that have looked at early fMRI studies of language in babies has so far almost exclusively tested sleeping babies, so not getting into language. The part that has puzzled me, and the reason I haven't jumped in quite yet, is that even with the toddlers, it's a very subtle difference between the two. And it's hard to know how to interpret. So in the toddlers, at least I have some measure of language ability. I have some, and again, my long list of analyses to do. I have some of the words that appear in the clips so that I can say, okay, these kids like understood the word mailbox in the clip about the mailboxes. So I have some ground truth of what they understand. In babies, like you said, they don't understand anything. So am I really studying a language response? Am I studying a speech response? Like what? So the answer is yes. I do think it would be interesting to bring it down to infants. I've still been puzzling over how I would interpret what I expect to be, if anything, a very small difference between the conditions, and whether to say, okay, it's driven by some familiarity with English, and so they recognize the sounds, or whether, I guess it would be hard to tell whether it's something about the familiarity with this. If we do see some difference and some familiar with the sounds, if we don't see a difference, is it because they think the backwards condition is just as meaningful as the forwards condition? So the reason I haven't jumped into it yet is that it's a hard endeavor, and I want to make sure I know what the most likely result of a very subtle, if any, difference would actually be. But I am tempted is the answer to your question.
I was just amazed to see the data from Nick.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
It's pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's big.
Yeah, it's just showing hippocampal memory responses in 4-month-olds.
Yeah, for what it's worth, yeah, babies are actually easier to scan because once you swaddle them up and stick them in there, they're actually pretty content. Toddlers are like old enough to have an opinion and not quite old enough to reason with. And so if there's anything more fun than being in the scanner, they'll do that instead. Yeah. Is there another? All right.
There's one question. Yeah, I do understand the problems of interpretation that you're talking about, especially with the young infants. But the thing is, because at one point you just mentioned in terms of like discussion that there is a process of understanding the role of social context on language development. Mm-hmm. Now, the question is that what we are looking at right now is a one point of the where you scan the participant by one point and then just gave them the stimulus. But then how would you test the process of, or the longitudinally the process of social context on language development? Right. And yes, you can start as early as possible, but then how would you interpret that data? And of course, with young infants, like even earlier as like 4 months or so, you have like more of these kind of like theory of mind processes. We don't know what that is actually, but then that is a point of social context. So how would you tease apart? And I mean, I know you have that difficulty in that context as well.
Sure. Well, and I guess I should say that there's the immediate question of like, oh, I haven't scanned babies yet, and also the like longer question of like, oh, what are you hoping to do in your career? And so yes, I think that I think there's a lot here. I think that longitudinal studies are a core piece of the developmental literature. I think that longitudinal studies will be really useful for answering these kinds of questions. I think that figuring out exactly which task conditions are most informative is the piece that I'm trying to figure out, especially which will be most informative in toddlers. So my first pass here was, okay, I think that some pretty gross monologue versus dialogue social context is something to try. Is that the only thing that might be like something that these regions might be sensitive to, like, no, maybe that wasn't quite the right one, but it seemed like it seemed like, well, if we were going to see it anywhere, maybe that's still a place that we would see it. But that doesn't seem to be a very sensitive contrast here, and maybe for an interesting reason, but maybe it's just not quite the right one. And also there are a bunch of other language contrasts. So again, as a first pass, it seemed like, okay, what's reasonable to get from this age group, given that no one scans awake toddlers, like, what's reasonable? And like, okay, 2x2 design and these two pretty like big differences seemed like a place to start. But then I think now is when we get into the next step of like, okay, so maybe it's like, maybe it's looking at kids with multilingual experience. I have a postdoc who sits next to me who has twins that are growing up multilingual, is up for longitudinal scanning, so perhaps that. But no, but kind of thinking about, all right, is it exposure to different languages? Is it a language that you're learning versus a completely different language? Is it, is it like a wordless condition versus comprehensible speech? Right now, it's full sentences versus some control, but maybe it's just like ball, bottle, words that they know, kind of wordless versus another condition. So I think figuring out what those levels are, and then for the social context too, like what are the different types of social manipulations that they might be sensitive to? The other thing is that I love fMRI. I think it's critical to understanding the full response across the brain, but it's not the ideal or best tool to use in toddlers, especially. I think we need it to find out where we should even be looking, but tools like EEG or fMIRS, those are very much better suited for studying this age group. And I think once we have some, and I think for some of these questions are like, oh, is it sensitive to this versus this? Those can be much more easily tested with these other tools. So I think that figuring out like, what do we really need fMRI for? And I think for understanding this full system, I didn't talk about, but like we get some cerebellar responses, like, or some cortical responses, like, those kinds of things we can't get out with mirrors.
There was some cerebellum. You had this.
I did. I showed the cerebellar response. Yeah. So I think fMRI is necessary and complementary, and doing awake fMRI is worth it. I mean, like, we need to at least like get a roadmap. I think this is a first pass, but then I think the really interesting questions are longitudinal, figure out other conditions, and also figure out when we need fMRI and when other tools can do a better job of also getting much more representative. Sorry, done.
No. Do we have any questions online?
We do not have any questions.
Now we can say. So with that, let me just thank you for